This is the Enjoyer Podcast. I'm your host, James Dixon. When the world thinks of Dearborn, it doesn't think of the 100,000 people who lives there. It thinks in terms of crude archetypes, the Arab vote, the old white vote. News outlets send reporters into the Detroit suburb as if trying to retrieve ancient wisdom. What they bring back doesn't always sound like they're talking to or about our neighbors. I see Dearborn a bit differently. I grew up right nearby in Inkster. And so if Dearborn was the town that birthed Henry Ford, Inkster was the town that Henry Ford kept alive. If Inkster coded and codes as black, Dearborn codes as not black, specifically. As a kid, all you see are other kids. As an adult, you come to realize that choices made long ago, long before you were born, affect your life and the character of your community. So 5 decades ago, Dearborn was shorthand for white. The late longtime mayor, Orville Hubbard, ran on a platform to keep Dearborn clean. When Hubbard said that civil rights leader Ralph Abernathy, a close associate of Dr. King, would be welcome to live in Dearborn, it was notable. And it was made just as clear that Hubbard was talking about Abernathy specifically. This was a one-man exemption. It was not a blanket grant for people who looked like him. So this one man, Abernathy, would be judged by the content of his character, the King standard, the rest by the color of their skin. This was Orville Hubbard's Dearborn. But Orville Hubbard isn't walking through that door. Today, his statue isn't even welcome within Dearborn city limits. It was removed from Dearborn City Hall many years ago, then moved to the Historical Museum, and then moved from there. Even if Hubbard did somehow walk through that door, he wouldn't recognize his city anymore, and there wouldn't be anyone at City Hall to take up his cause. While Hubbard was working so hard to keep blacks out, Arab Muslims moved to Dearborn in great numbers. So if in 1974 Dearborn was a proud white city, in 2024 it's viewed as a Muslim city with a white past. Today Dearborn's the fascination of the world, especially in politics. The Uncommitted movement against President Joe Biden had its roots here. This has morphed into the Abandon Harris movement, which recently endorsed Jill Stein as president. When I need to understand modern-day Dearborn, I call Dawud Walid. Dawud is executive director of the Michigan chapter of CAIR, which is the Council on American Islamic Relations. Walid has a unique vantage point. He's a Muslim and a leader in that community, but he's also a black man and a leader in that community. When my New York Post editor sent me to Dearborn to learn what became of the Uncommitted movement, Walid was the first one to point to Jill Stein as a possible home for those voters. So Walid's finger is on the pulse, his eye is accurate, and it's my pleasure today to welcome Dawud Walid to the Enjoyer Podcast. Dawud, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure being on.
Absolutely. Knowing you a long time, it is a blessing to see your face and hear your voice.
Yes.
We'll start you here. What do you enjoy about Michigan?
Well, Michigan was a place of my birth, but then we moved to Virginia, and much of my upbringing was in Central Virginia. After my 4 years in the U.S. Navy, I decided to come back to Michigan and pursue my education and finish college, and I ended up staying here. I have family here. This is the city of Motown. It's the city of where my grandparents moved, actually, from escaping Jim Crow. My great-grandmother and grandmother came here around the time of World War I from Montgomery, Alabama. And then my grandfather, my father's father, came from rural Georgia, looking for opportunities, which he found working in the Fisher plant. So I have roots here. My father is an alum of the University of Michigan. I kind of grew up on the subway. Go Blue. Yeah, he got his MBA, a master's in business administration from the University of Michigan. And so I have a lot of fond memories, family ties. And over the years, I've developed a lot of connections in the community, both the African-American community, obviously, but then also Muslims of various hues, ethnicities, and national origins who decided to make our great country home.
I found it so fascinating when you were talking about how your grandfather came to be here. Mine, from what I understand of it, Louisiana. Yours was Alabama, mine Louisiana. And from my understanding, it was more economic. But then I think about those two factors, right? That would have driven someone from the South, which people love today, to up here to the Great White North, and both those things are gone now. This was a time before air conditioning, so if you wanted a place that was a little bit more hospitable, a livable, Michigan had a clear advantage over the South. But then there was also Jim Crow, so there was a lot you were escaping in the South, and a lot you were coming to in Michigan, and there's pretty much no black population before Henry Ford in Michigan. There are very few, like less than 1%, something like that, in 1910. And it's just so fascinating that for us to have this conversation, and our state's history is basically an anomaly of history.
It is, and we need to give Henry Ford his props, and he's a controversial historical figure to
Absolutely.
many people, but he's the first industrialist to give a non-white man the same hourly wage in the factory as a black man. So, in regards to this, he was concerned about work product, and hence you talked about the Arab migration in the Dearborn, and initially they first settled in Highland Park, but they came to work in the automobile industry and were seen as industrious and hard workers, and that's how they were able to thrive. People came here to the American dream for the American dream. They rolled up their sleeves and they got to work. They didn't come here asking for handouts, and Henry Ford appreciated that, just like some of our forefathers who migrated from Jim Crow South, who were hard workers, grew up in
Right.
farm areas, and they came here and made a life for themselves. And I mean, not long ago, I mean, Detroit's a blown out city now, but it was, the home of the black middle class. Black folks didn't look anywhere
Absolutely.
better in America than right here in the Motor City. And that's because our people, they had jobs, but they worked, and they weren't asking for any handouts.
I preferred that version of events. I mean, so a century ago, there's the great book. I believe it's called Henry Ford and the Making of Black Detroit. It was published about a decade ago, and it found that in the 1920s, so a century ago, if you were a black man like ourselves, you might the most common job we had back then was being a Pullman porter. So working on a train station. It's actually depicted in Malcolm X, that kind of job where you're working on the train cars and serving people their meals. But then, like you said, now you could work for Ford. You might get the dirty job. You might get, the hard job, the dangerous
The
job.
foundry.
My grandfather, exactly, the foundry. And that's where my grandfather worked and was hurt. It no doubt shortened his life. And the only thing worse is what he would have done if he didn't have that.
That's right. That's right. And so, I'm thankful for Detroit and the opportunities it gave, to my family, and, even the benefit that I've had. All three of my children were born, right at Henry Ford Hospital, on the west side of Detroit. And
Right.
so, we're thankful for our city, though our region needs some help. And I think that, when we're talking about the elections and what's going on, a lot of Americans are disenchanted with the current political status quo, and
Right.
people are looking for a better America.
Now, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to occupy the position you do at CAIR Michigan. People might be shocked that a black man is able to rise to this stature in the Muslim community. I remember growing up in Inkster, and in retrospect, I've heard about a lot more Arab anti-black racism than I've ever experienced. I can't think of an actual incident um, involving myself or anyone I've known. But you heard this specter of it. Have you found that to be true, and how'd you come to rise so high in your community?
Well, all I can say is that, God afforded me the opportunity to be in this position. I think many times when people forget that the roots of the Muslim community in the United States of America actually starts with African Americans. It starts in the
Mm,
very beginning with a significant percentage of enslaved Africans who were brought here to the Americas were actually Muslims. Then, specifically in the city of Detroit, what some call a proto-Islamic movement of the Nation of Islam was founded
Yes.
in the city of Detroit in 1930.
W.D. Farr.
Yeah, when Malcolm X got out of prison, he actually came and he stayed in Inkster, Michigan,
Yes.
a so-called Detroit Red, or as he was termed. And then, a number of Muslims who of the Sunni expression of Islam or mainstream or orthodoxy, which I'm a part of, people started coming to that in Detroit as well in the early 1920s in the city of Detroit. And I know families that go all the way back then. There was actually a man by the name of Dusey Muhammad Ali, who was half Sudanese, half Egyptian, who came into the Black community in the area of Highland Park in Hamtramck, and he started speaking about Islam. And there were African Americans who accepted way back in the 1920s. So there's a rich old history. And even in the state of Michigan now, about 1/3 of of the Muslim community in Michigan are Black folks, statistically speaking. So many times when people think about Muslims, they think of Arab Americans, when in fact, Arab
Right.
Americans are actually a minority of the American Muslim population, and they're a minority of the Michigan Muslim population. They are not the largest percentage. However, when we think of Dearborn, which is still it's close to 50% Arab American, and people forget that the majority of Arab Americans are Christians. And there are Christian Arabs in Dearborn. The majority of them are Muslim. But, so much about Islam in America seems to be concretized and focused around Dearborn, when in fact, Dearborn is quite an anomaly in the American Muslim landscape. And even Hamtramck is actually the only Muslim majority town in America. And
Right, where they run the city.
yeah, but Dearborn is not, even though Dearborn has a Muslim mayor and a Muslim police chief, I both know them. Dearborn is not majority Muslim, and I think that's important for people to understand. There's the old guard Dearbornites that live in West Dearborn.
Oh yeah.
They're still there. Some of those people.
I'm on Telegraph and 10 Mile, so when I'm on, down way south, like that's the white part of Dearborn, near the golf course and all that, those homes. Oh my God. It could be as expensive as buying a home in Birmingham out there.
Definitely. So some of the proverbial children of Orville Hubbard still live out in West Dearborn. That mindset has not totally left the city of Dearborn. I'm not talking about skin color. I'm talking about a mindset.
Right.
But the predominance of Muslims in Dearborn live in South Dearborn by the Rouge plant. And most of those are first, second, and third generation Yemeni Americans. And then you have the issue of, then you have East Dearborn, and many of those are Lebanese Americans and Palestinian Americans. And then you go further west where there's a section called Warrendale, which is technically Detroit, before you get to Dearborn Heights. And a lot of those are Iraqis who first came here as refugees after Desert Storm. And those were the Shia Muslims that had been persecuted by Saddam Hussein that fled Iraq, and they went into refugee camps. And then at the time, our former president, George H.W. Bush, was the ones who welcomed them after we helped to liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein.
See, and that's fascinating because I think when people think of Dearborn, they think of a Muslim man, basically, and maybe a woman, and she'd be, fully with the gear, the burqa, and the full adornment. But you're saying there's like 6 different types. So when you talk about the Dearborn Muslim, it's like, who are you talking about specifically?
Yeah, I mean, all of the Arabs are not Muslims. And then there's different types of Muslims. There's Sunni Muslims. There's the Shia Muslims. They come from different backgrounds. And also, when people think of Arab is a kind of like a macro ethnic group, right? But within these different subgroups, they have different cultural distinctions and even have slightly different dialects of Arabic. It's like if we were to say Latino, like
Yes,
Latino.
that's exactly what was in my
Yeah,
mind when you said
Latino is
that.
not a race. You can have
Right.
Cubans that look like you
Hmm.
and me, right? And they have their own dialect. And then you can see someone from Peru who's supposedly Latino, who looks more like
Right.
an indigenous, like Native American, and they have a different dialect. They eat totally different foods. Their music is different. And you'll find the same thing about amongst Arabs themselves. You will find a few things that are culturally the same, but you would even find different words used, different dialect, and how they speak Arabic, but different food dishes, slightly different dress. And I know these things because I'm like part and parcel of the community. So I can kind of look at their faces or their dress and tell
Right.
their cultural origin. But many times we just do lazy things. Oh, it's the Arabs, the Arabs, the Arabs. But there
Absolutely.
is no like one monolithic Arab.
Right. Right. And so, even to talk about the Dearborn vote, it's like which Dearborn vote, which community, which subgroup are we talking about? And part of the reason there was an interest in Dearborn is not just Uncommitted, but also, Harris was able to choose her running mate. And there's a belief, even among Democrats, and this hasn't even really been the quiet part said out loud. People have kind of said it openly since it happened, but there's this belief that Kamala Harris didn't choose Josh Shapiro, that she chose Tim Walz instead. She passed on a popular governor of a swing state, Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, kind of the closest politician we have to Obama in speaking style now, because she didn't want to turn off the Muslim vote. But then we see, you mentioned that it was going to happen, and then I was just there the other day when it did happen, when the Uncommitted movement, now the Abandoned Harris movement, who do they endorse besides a little Jewish woman and Jill Stein? Another thing I think about, a few years ago when I was news reporting, there was this Jewish community doing some obscure tradition called Slug Kapores. It involves a butchered chicken and waving it over your head and whatever it was. And there was a federal hearing about it. And I was shocked to learn that in Metro Detroit, which is, we have a pretty strong Jewish community here in Metro Detroit, but even they, as strong as the community is, need to get their kosher butchering done by halal butchers. And so these two communities that are portrayed as being at odds, actually one of them could not observe their religious rights but for the help and cooperation and brotherhood with another. Is the Jewish thing overblown in your mind?
Yeah, I think it's totally overblown that there's some sort of, uh, animus or hatred within the Muslim community or Arabs in general just because of Jewish identity. If we
Right.
go back a couple of elections for the Democratic primary, prior to this one, Dearborn, the majority voted for Bernie Sanders, right, over Hillary
Another
Clinton
one.
and
Right.
over Joe Biden for the Democratic nominee. They were calling him Uncle Bernie, and Uncle Bernie is Jewish.
Right.
So I mean that's kind of overblown. Now there's some disagreement in regards to American policy in terms of Israel, but just as there is no monolithic view within the Jewish community about the Netanyahu government, right?
Right.
Right,
Right.
and that's very clear, right? Likewise, uh, we shouldn't have like jump to these very rushed conclusions that just because uh, Arab Americans in Dearborn don't like what the Israeli government is doing to Palestinians and Lebanese because they have family members
Right.
there. It's not a foreign policy issue for them. That somehow there's a hatred for Jewish people, and that's simply not the case.
Right. It just hasn't materialized in the way you would expect were that to happen. And so you were the first person to mention Jill Stein. I'm like, I'm thinking, hey, maybe people are open to Donald Trump after all this point. What did you see that made you think it wouldn't go that way, but it might go to Stein instead?
So let's, before getting into that, just let you know that in the most recent polls, it's saying now that Donald Trump is receiving a greater percentage of Arab American support than Kamala Harris.
I was going to
So
ask you about that, if you thought that was valid.
released. I'm personal
Yeah.
friends with the mayor of Hamtramck, Mayor Ghalib. He endorsed.
Yes.
Also, the mayor of Dearborn Heights, who's a Muslim, Bill Bezzi, former Marine. I know him well. We're both veterans. He just endorsed Donald Trump. And there's a lot of young Arab Americans who are Yemeni American, who are Lebanese American, who support Donald Trump to be the 47th president of the United States. Now, why I pointed towards Jill Stein was a couple of reasons. Number one, many people in the Arab American community feel betrayed by the Biden Harris administration, right? This is number one. And it's for several reasons. Of course, what's going on in the Middle East is a primary reason, but not the only reason. But also, the second reason about this is that it is believed that Kamala Harris, by many people in our community, believe that she cannot be trusted, right? So it's like she tries to criticize, President Trump and have certain ads, but it's believed that she's in the pockets of Wall Street. She's in the pockets of special interests, big pharma, the military industrial complex. So basically she speaks with a forked tongue. So people in the community are like, we can't trust her. So for the ones who don't like Donald Trump, they don't like her either. They probably dislike her more than Donald Trump. So they look for an option. And so when Jill Stein picked Dr. Butch Ware to be her running mate, he's a Muslim American. He taught at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor for 10 years, right? When she chose him, and he's a personal friend of mine, all disclosure, I knew that based upon his network and his thoughts about breaking from the duopoly of the Democratic and Republican Party control over the political system, I knew that it was going to resonate with Muslims here because he has roots here, but it was spread across the country. And now when we look at polls, we see that the majority of American Muslims are in support of and plan on voting for third-party candidates. And some already have because of early voting. I've talked to some people who already voted for Jill Stein, but some of them already voted for Trump. And right now, people in our community aren't feeling Kamala Harris. And frankly, it's very hard for her to have a road to the White House going around Michigan. And Muslims in Michigan constitute a high enough percentage in a close race that depending on how Muslims vote, this could cost Vice President Harris Michigan. Also, a lot of young African American men, be they Muslim or not Muslim, are gravitating towards Donald Trump. I have people in my family who told me that they're voting for Donald Trump, right? Who are Black and who are Muslim. So that's just to say that it's not looking good. We'll see how it shakes out in November on Election Day. But it was quite easy for me to see that people were going to go to support the Jewish doctor Jill Stein in the Muslim community.
And the other part that I found surprising, and I think as people get to know the Muslim community, they probably would too. If I had a criticism of Christianity, it's too often I hear messages and that are done in the voice of a woman, essentially. Whereas it's clear pretty much that in Islam, God is a man. There doesn't seem to be any confusion about that. And so I just see a much more male and masculine faith in Islam. Is it surprising that Muslims would get behind a woman of any extraction, Jewish or not?
So, yeah, you raise an interesting point. So two things. Number one, a theological clarification. Muslims and in our holy book, the Quran, is referred to God as a he, but this he is what we could say a description of God, but it is not believed in Islam that God is actually a man.
Mm,
This would be anthropomorphism to us. So we say that God is the creator and he's called he, but there is nothing like him in physical creation, meaning that God doesn't have male genitalia, just to be clear.
right,
According from this
right.
perspective. Now, can Muslims get behind a woman? Well, the former prime minister of Bangladesh, who ruled for a while, who actually got ran out on corruption, was a woman. Pakistan has had a woman head, Benazir Bhutto.
Bhutto, yeah, that didn't go well.
She was voted in first, and then she got ran out for corruption. Then when she came back, she got assassinated. But that wasn't because she was a woman. Indonesia, the most populous Muslim country in the world, has had a female president, and there's been some other Muslim countries. So I don't think that necessarily that Muslims would not support a woman simply because of gender, but it's more based upon policy and also demeanor. So, of course, within the Islamic faith, traditionally speaking, leadership has been with men, and this leadership has to exude a certain sort of presence and a certain sort of vigor and strength,
Right.
right? Because when you're dealing with adversaries, you can't have anyone who's coming off the appear to be docile or weak, right? And
Right.
this is considered traditionally to be a male attribute, right?
Right.
So, in that regard, I look, I listen to Washington Journal almost every morning, James.
Do you?
Yeah, I listen to them almost every morning. Even I call in every once in a while. I've even heard some women who call on the Democrat line who have confessed that they can't vote for Kamala because she's a woman, because they said that when we need someone to negotiate or face off against Putin or Kim Jong Un or the supreme leader of Iran, that they don't want
Right.
someone that's going to come off looking wishy washy or not firm. They need someone
Yes.
that's like Trump. And I've heard like Christian people who aren't Muslim, who are Democrats, who even said that, much less Republicans or independents. So I think that's something that kind of stretches across, many groups of people, especially when they adhere to certain traditional gender roles.
You know, you just made a fascinating point. I think about the 1960 election. It was a big question, the Catholic question. Could Americans elect a Catholic? Could they trust that our president was going to be an independent man and not a puppet of Rome if they were to elect a Catholic? And then 2008. Could America actually elect? Would America let a black man hold the checkbook? I mean, it was almost unthinkable, and it really took a guy who messed things up as bad as George W. Bush to even put that into consideration. But in both cases, I think we wrestled openly with these questions, and we were allowed to have these questions. And you know, it gave Kennedy and it gave Obama, in addressing the concerns, a platform to explain themselves and to show that no, I am like you, whatever concerns you might have. Why are we not even talking about the woman question this time around, which is, are people really ready for a woman president?
I think there's three reasons. Number one, the majority of the electorate is female in America now. So it's become a taboo subject. Even I
Yeah.
checked the last census and I said, and you can see that there are 8 million more women than men in America, right? Even if every woman in America was straight and wanted to get married, there wouldn't be enough men,
Right.
literally.
Wow.
So there's 8 million more women. So that's number one. Like it's a politically unpopular discussion. Number two, you have the after effects of the Me Too movement. And even we know
Mm,
some people that were collateral damage of that, who lost jobs, lost positions, who were innocent of charges,
absolutely.
right? I can think of Stephen Henderson, who was a collateral of that, who was unjustly let go at the Detroit Free Press over a loose allegation that turned out not to be true. And, he was rising in national notoriety at the Detroit Free Press.
Pulitzer Prize
Yeah.
winner.
And now, he's on WDTE, and he wasn't welcome back at the Free Press, even though he was let go unjustly. And a woman took over his position. And then you have now other things such as Diddy. Diddy is one of the big cultural news stories during the election year. So
Right.
so anything can be labeled as being misogynistic or exploitive of women.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not really a political environment that's conducive to having those types of conversations right now. It appears. I think that when we talk about the United States of America and freedom of speech, that means that we should be free to have uncomfortable conversations. And if people want to have those uncomfortable conversations, I don't think they should be written off as a self-hating woman if they bring
Right.
up these things, or someone is labeled a misogynist if they so believe that there is a difference between men and women. And all of it's not just biological. If people want to have that discussion, I think they should be able to have that discussion. But unfortunately, with the particular culture we have, cancel culture and things such as that, there's certain conversations that aren't able to be had.
Absolutely. We mentioned earlier, this talk, this trope, really, that there's all this, anti-black racism in the Muslim community. And like I said, I'd heard a lot about it growing up. Can't say I ever saw it. Can't say I ever experienced it. But I did see a change. Even from not having experienced it myself, I saw much more of a friendliness after 9/11. And my theory is what you had was a community that needed a friend and understood that, hey, we might not always get along with these people per se, but they certainly don't think that we're like enemies or anything like that. Did you see any kind of change in the community after 9/11 where they're just more understanding that, hey, everybody needs somebody?
Well, I'd say this: there's racist people in the Christian community. I mean, that's why there's a First Baptist Church and a Second Baptist Church.
Right.
And it's not to say that Muslims are post-racial. There's racism that exists amongst Muslims, but institutionally speaking, I would say that, as it was once said, I believe by Malcolm X, that the most segregated hour in America was 12 o'clock on Sunday.
Yeah.
I would say that during the Muslim prayer service time, which is on Friday, let's say around noon, the most integrated time of worship in America would be at the prayer service on Friday in mosque, because you will see a prayer leader who is not from the majority ethnicity. Many times you'll see people whose ancestry could be from Albania and Bosnia praying next to an Arab, praying next to an African American, praying next to an immigrant or a child of immigrants from Senegal or Nigeria, right, all in one mosque. And this is normal, right? This is a normal occurrence, including you'll see this in Dearborn. So I would say that this is inside the community. Now, outside of the community, there is a problem, but I don't think it relates to religion. And I think what the problem is more of a class issue. Because the reality is, for many people who are Arab Americans, their relationship with black folk is a transactional relationship. It's someone who owns.
You come to my store.
Someone owns a gas station.
Mm-hmm.
You're sliding some money for, give me 25 on pump 2, and you're sliding it underneath the bulletproof glass.
Bulletproof,
right? Yeah. And then the guy will sell you a Lucy, which I think those are illegal. And then you have the Metro PCS or the phone store, the T-Mobile phone store you're doing business. And then all the party stores are owned by Chaldeans. And those are Iraqi Christians. Those aren't Muslims that own. That's easy way you could tell. The party stores are owned by the Christians. The gas stations are owned by the Muslims. Right. And so many times when people are doing business with Arabs, be they Muslims or Christians, black folks, the majority of it is of a transactional nature is not on a personal level, right? So that can cause some animosity
Right.
and understanding. And sometimes the store owners act excessively towards patrons and disrespect them. And then sometimes store owners who are doing legal business have real concern about their safety, like there's store owners who get killed,
Right.
by black folks, Arabs, if we're going to be, frank about it. So I think that's more of an issue of class. I don't really chalk it up as a racism issue, in my personal opinion.
It's also an issue of clash, where you only have these things that turn into violence when you have meaningful contact with each other. And so even if it's that transaction, well, okay, if I have a store in a community, and even if people are overwhelmingly good to me and I'm good to them, if someone were to burn me, who would it be? One of them.
That's right.
And if someone were to disrespect me, who runs the store, who's it going to be? One of them.
Yeah.
And so I think you have two communities that kind of, because we are forced to deal with each other, maybe some of that's where the discomfort comes from in those cases.
Yeah, but that's fading away with time. You see now interracial marriages between black folk and Arab folk. Sometimes it's Arab men with black women, but more predominantly it's Arab women with black men. You see it in the Muslim community.
We knew a family like that 30 years ago, and it was not widely accepted at the time. But when people realized the guy wasn't going anywhere, you want to have access to your grandkids, you grow up.
Yeah, it's more acceptable now, and same thing even with Arab women marrying white men. Like it's become more. I have a couple of friends who are white converts to Islam who have Arab wives. So I mean, it's those things break down in time. It's just like how it used to be with black Americans and white Americans, and a lot of that has been torn down over the decades, right? So
I think 9/11 was also the accelerator there. I think people could look at you and say, damn, we put black people through a lot of stuff. They never did nothing like this. It's like, it felt like at that point, there was no question of Americanness. Like you were grandfathered in essentially, because look, we've been through the civil rights, the wars, ain't nobody leaving. And we weren't viewed as the newcomers anymore. I did see a change there.
Okay.
You mentioned in your, Nation of Islam versus, Islam. Are those viewed as the same thing? Like, the Muslims view Nation of Islam as a legitimate alternative, like Sunni Shia, or is it kind of viewed as like how Christians view Mormons as not Christians?
You took the words right out of my mouth. It would be like how, a Baptist, would view the Mormons or Jehovah's Witness. It'd be the same thing. It's the same category. Like it's kind of like Christian-ish, but not really.
Yes.
Christian. So I would say that
concepts of Christianity, but not quite there.
Yeah. So it's the same thing with the Nation of Islam and Minister Louis Farrakhan. And Minister Louis Farrakhan is still, a popular figure amongst a segment of Black America in general, whether they identify as Muslim or not. And much of that has to do with his social conservatism and doing for self, and talking about family values, which it seems like people don't want to talk about anymore. But I mean, maybe that's for another podcast. But no, they're seen as, or maybe a better word is Muslim adjacent. So yeah, they identify as Muslim, but in reality, if you were to go into Dearborn and ask people, do you believe that the followers of Farrakhan are Muslim equally to me? They would say no.
Right. Barack Obama turned off a lot of people recently. He was speaking, somehow this video got leaked. I think that kind of told you how big his problem was. He was speaking to a group of black male Harris volunteers, like the true believers. He was literally preaching to the choir, and he urged them to get the brothers in line. So the brothers in that room got it, but the brothers outside the room who needed it weren't doing it. Instead of talking to them in the streets, Obama talked to the guys who talked to them. This turned people off. Then, I think in 2008, so many black people were proud of Obama because there was a factor of when my kid turns to that back page of their elementary school history book, they'll see a guy there on that page of presidents who looks like them now. And that mattered. And perhaps it still matters. But now there's a second one who's come along. And so you could overlook some things with any one, right? If it was either just Obama or just Harris. But now we look at it and we see, okay, we got Barack Obama, middle name Hussein. Kamala Harris, middle name Devi. These are not black Americans. And so what we saw that day with that Obama speech was Hussein telling black men to get in line behind Devi, and that this was even some kind of civic good. It didn't go well. It was widely viewed as insulting. How did Obama's little pep talk land with you?
So I would say two things. If that were Master Louis Farrakhan talking to black men about pick yourself up and do something, people would have respected it. And that's because he's seen as part of the black community authentically and a grassroots guy. Barack Obama has a history of being condescending towards black men. If you remember, he gave a commencement speech at Morehouse College, historical black college, speaking to black men, talking about how they need to be responsible. Like, these are black men who busted their behinds and graduated. And
those are the most responsible cohort you'll find.
The most responsible cohort you'll find. And most of those people who go there, their parents or fathers are alumni. They're Morehouse men, right? We're talking about the black bourgeoisie. And he's down talking them. He's done that more than once, even beyond Morehouse. So he has a history of down talking to foundational black Americans. Like Barack Obama, father was Kenyan, was barely in his life. He went off to Indonesia and was raised by Indonesian stepfather, going Barry Soetoro. And then he lived in Hawaii, and he didn't even grow up amongst African Americans. His lineage isn't African American.
No.
And then so he's talking down to black folk for Kamala Harris, who has questionable lineage on her paternal side, but she wasn't even raised by a black man.
No.
She was raised in a Hindu family and then got taken up and went to high school up in Canada, in Vancouver. And then I think her first real interaction with black folk was at Howard University.
Like many of these blacks, they find out that they're black in college.
Yeah, I'm not even sure if she is black.
No.
So
there's no reason to think she is.
Yeah. So this is a bigger problem than the election, but it's a problem of generally like cultural authenticity and people who want to come to lecture to black folk as if we aren't responsible. So it's almost it's funny because people who are white supremacists, and I believe that white supremacists are a very minuscule population of the American society, very minuscule, but the white supremacists would deal into tropes like no black men are responsible, no black men are married, no black men go after education, no black men take care of their churches or their houses of worship.
Right.
And they're
and who do you hear that from now?
And they're irresponsible. And now we hear Barack Hussein Obama parroting David Duke talking points in a sense. So it's a real bizarre environment that we live in. And unfortunately for Vice President Harris, I think missteps like that and also her talking about her washing collard greens in a bathtub and all these other cartoonish talking points. This is what's turning young black men off her.
Absolutely. We'll get you out of here on this one. I think back to the 2022 election. A lot of people had hope on the Republican side that with all the degenerate books that are being in school libraries and classrooms, obviously Muslims showed up in great numbers to the Dearborn school board meetings. It was a thing. It was a vibe. It was a real moment. And then you referenced the poll earlier that has Trump, at 45% of the Muslim vote, which shocked me. Do you think a number like that is possible? Or I guess put another way, this Muslim Republican connection that Republicans have coveted now 2 cycles straight pretty openly, do you think that will actually materialize?
Well, the Muslim vote is for the Republicans to gain. What was lost in American consciousness is that prior to the second Bush term, if we look back at year 2000, the majority of Muslims actually voted for George W. Bush as president. They were not Democrats. And the reason why people voted for George Bush was a few reasons. Number one, traditional family values. Muslims in general are not for the LGBTQ lifestyle. Muslims in general are not in favor of abortion or rebranding prostitution as sex work, decriminalizing drugs. That's not. Muslims are normally, the overwhelming majority of Muslims have traditional family values.
Right.
Number one. Number two, that George Bush talked about undoing something called secret evidence, which was put in by the Bill Clinton administration, which is basically finding people guilty of crimes or censuring people without them being able to have due process. So, like, we're talking about Fifth Amendment right issues, right? And when it looked at the also besides these two things, generally speaking, within the community, it seemed to be that outside of the union movement, that the Republican Party was more open to courting Muslims than the Democrats. So then after 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq and the Patriot Act and a number of these sorts of policies, this pushed Muslims to the Democrats because Republicans stopped being cordial with Muslims, right? Now this is it's starting to thaw off. And you mentioned 2 years ago, and now President Trump and his campaign, not just him, but for the past year, have been openly courting, seeking to have listening sessions, to meet with Muslims, to listen, Muslims out in Oakland County, out in West Bloomfield, and even down in Hamtramck, Dearborn, and other places. And now Muslims have met a couple of times in Michigan with Trump, and coming up soon, I know of 2 religious leaders, imams, who are going to have a personal meeting with Donald Trump. So the Republicans can easily get back Muslim votes if Muslims are seen as, if they're seen as respecting Muslims, and if they're seen as not being globalists and seem to want to perpetuate endless wars throughout the world, and to use that money here to rebuild our schools, our roads. Gresham Whitmer says she was going to fix the roads.
Hasn't happened.
To make sure that our schools are functioning properly, to make sure that that Americans are able to afford homes, because Muslims want to live in homes just like Christians and Jews and everyone else. That if Republicans can do those things and not use anti-Muslim rhetoric, then Muslims will go back to the Republican Party. So you can quote me on this right now. If President Trump is the next president and he does good on some of the things that he's doing, I could see within 2 years now, when we look at the congressional races, you'll see many more Muslims who are leaving the Democratic Party even more than now. And some of those will be third party, but I believe a number of those will migrate over to the Republican Party because they used to be part of the Republican Party, or their parents used to be Republicans. Right. So, it depends on how the state Republican Party in Michigan, and how the Trump administration coming up, how they play it, if there is a Trump administration, if he is the 47th president.
Big if. Dawud, where can people learn more about yourself? Where can people learn more about CAIR Michigan?
So people can go to cairmichigan.org, and that's CAIR, CAIR, Michigan.org. CAIR stands for Council on American Islamic Relations. Also, I have a YouTube page, so if anyone just goes and types up my name on YouTube, then they can find videos of talks that I give and also commentary from time to time about certain social political issues.
Beautiful. Dawud, thank you so much. This has been so informative, such a great conversation. I appreciate you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you for having me on anytime.